Hello and welcome. I'm Natasha Luthwaite. I'm one of the neurological physiotherapists working here at Advanced Rehab Centre. Today, we're going to talk about the key points on how to improve your mobility after a stroke. Before we begin, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, our Academy and Advanced Rehab Centre acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where we host this webinar today. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So thank you for joining. I think we might have a few more people trickling in. If you could just please ensure that you are muted, and if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat box and I'll answer questions at the end, unless we've got a really burning question. But there is a reasonable amount of content that we're going to cover today. So our main objectives of today are to understand what evidence-based practice means, to review the evidence of training sitting, standing, walking, and balance, and to understand what stroke survivors and their families and friends can do to optimize recovery after stroke. So our first objective is to understand the importance of evidence-based practice. We'll do this really briefly, just in order to understand some of the following content. You might have heard the term evidence-based practice used by your physiotherapist, exercise physiologist, or occupational therapist. So here at ARC, we spend quite a lot of time reviewing the recent evidence so that we're making sure we're providing our clients with the most up-to-date information and therefore treatments. But what does evidence actually mean? The Encyclopedia Britannica defines evidence as something which shows that something else exists or is true. So in healthcare, researchers do studies where they compare the results of two groups of people when they try a different treatment. For example, excuse me, imagine you have a group of people that have recently had a stroke and can't stand up from a chair. You need a specific starting measure, such as the ability to stand up from a chair, say 50 centimetres high. We might split them into groups, so you have two groups. One group, we get to practice standing up from a chair that's taller than the 50 centimetre chair, and the other group practices like sitting using some stationary pedals. We decide on a set time period, such as 2 weeks, and after that 2 weeks, we count how many people in each group can now stand up. We then use the difference in the number of people that can stand up to determine which treatment we think is more effective. So evidence-based practice that we talk a lot about here at ARC is when healthcare professionals use what the researchers have found in their studies when we're actually working with that clinical population. So for the purpose of this webinar, clients who've had a stroke. For example, if the research shows that more people are better at standing up after they've been practicing standing up, then that's what we're going to practice with them. As you can see in this diagram, we class evidence as a hierarchy. So at the bottom here, we talk about expert opinion, and then at the top here, we have systematic reviews. So the higher on the pyramid, the higher the quality of the evidence. A systematic review is when the researchers take the results of multiple studies and pull them together. The more data that we have, the stronger the evidence we have to support a certain statement. This could include recommending a certain treatment or say that there's little or weak evidence to support something. Just keep in mind, though, that little or weak evidence can be due to a range of factors. That could be that there is no evidence support, that there is no reason to support a certain treatment. It could be that it's difficult due to ethics to design a study. It might be difficulty comparing different interventions, or that it's a new area of research that hasn't been well researched recently. So please keep that in mind as we move forwards. In terms of stroke, Australia and New Zealand have a set of shared living guidelines. So these are guidelines put together by the researchers with links to the original research for clinicians and stroke survivors to use. These range from kind of acute medical interventions all the way through to rehabilitation, like what you'd be receiving here at ARC. These guidelines are a living document, so they are updated every 6 months to account for any new research that's been completed, and we're quite familiar with these. So now that we understand what evidence-based practice means, our next objective is to review the evidence for training mobility. We often break mobility into a continuum. So to be able to walk, you first need to be able to sit, and you need to be able to move from sitting into standing. You need to be able to stand, hold yourself in standing, move into walking, and potentially into running. But at all of these levels, you need to be able to hold yourself upright or to prevent yourself from falling over. In other words, to balance. Another term you may have heard your therapist at Advanced Rehab Centre use is neuroplasticity. So essentially, this is the ability of the brain to change and learn. We know that our brain cells, called neurons, are constantly looking for new connections. When two neurons make a connection, it makes a pathway, for example, from our brain down to our little toe muscle. Then we can wiggle our little toe. But we can't just have this connection once and be amazing at the skill or the task. We need to actually repeat the task or movement many, many, many times. Think about a baby or a toddler learning to walk. This is where your therapists at ARC will use the principles of neuroplasticity. So I'm just going to review some of these that I think were most important for this context. So use it or lose it. You might have heard this before. This is essentially when if you don't practice a skill, your brain doesn't bother to retain that skill or that pathway. Complexity. If the task isn't challenging, you're not going to learn anything new. Specificity. The training needs to be specific to what you want to learn. Sitting or pedaling with your legs isn't going to help you learn the task of balancing on one leg with your eyes closed. Repetition. The more practice, the stronger the connections are between that brain and the rest of your body. Intensity. If you're not focused on the task and you're not trying hard enough, your brain's not going to bother learning the skill. Timing. There are different mechanisms happening at different stages after stroke, both at the cell level and at the brain level. We know that the best recovery after stroke is normally from within the first 6 to 12 months. But if you are further along in your stroke recovery journey than 12 months, don't be dismayed. We see plenty of people, both here at ARC and in the scientific literature, that continue to make quite significant recovery after that 12-month mark. And salience. So the task or skill that you're learning needs to have meaning to you. At ARC, your therapist will spend quite a lot of time discussing your goals with you so that they can direct your therapy towards what you want to get better at and enjoy. As we move through this presentation, I've added a brain, this red brain here, to help you identify when there's something that you can do to help influence your journey. Before we get too far along, I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of repetition in practice. So as therapists, we really want you to be practicing outside of your appointments with us. Obviously, that's within reason. We can't have you tiring yourselves out or experiencing a nasty fall or something like that. So this is quite a complicated diagram that you can see here. This is from a systematic review looking at how much practice actually led to improved changes in people's function. Essentially, what it's saying is that you need to be doing lots of practice. About 240% increase, or about 3 times increase to what most people are doing. So if you're practicing a skill from about 30 minutes a day, you need to be bringing that up to more like 120 minutes. To put this into perspective that might make a bit more sense for you, here at ARC we run a stand, walk, run program. So this is an intensive program for the lower limb, obviously looking at people's ability to sit to stand and balance, walk, or even run. For this program, we advise a minimum of 10 hours a week, which includes your therapy appointments. So often you might have 2 or 3 physio appointments a week, and you might have 2 or 3 exercise physiology appointments a week. Those are 1 hour each, that's 6 hours. You've still got another 4 hours to do in your own time. This is when we might use things like group classes, such as our neuro gym and neuro balance classes, home exercise program, going to the gym, the pool, or spending some time walking kind of with a friend to help build up that time. So you're really getting that repetition in. But please do talk to your therapist about what's right for you. Our job isn't just to throw things at you to practice, but to work with you to find out what's going to be the best way that you can do these things safely to help reach your goals. If you are practicing at home, please remember to be safe and don't forget to work hard. And with that in mind, I'd just like to talk about intensity very briefly. So working hard is really important to ensure that your brain is deciding, okay, I need to work on developing this skill. We know that this helps to improve the neuroplasticity, so that's the ability of that brain to change and create those new pathways. So what the literature or the scientific studies have shown is that we need to aim for a maximum, 65 to 80% of your maximum heart rate. This allows for increased blood flow to the brain, which helps your brain make those improvements and changes. Exercise physiologists will often use a heart rate monitor. You might have seen it. They'll often strap it to just above or below your elbow, and us as physiotherapists will often use that as well. And this is to ensure that we can be working you at the right intensity that the science tells us we need to be working you at. The other way we can do that is through use of this table, or modified Borg scale, or the RPE, rate of perceived exertion. So you might have seen these around both our Tarman and Hurstville clinics, and some of us, like myself, carry it when we come out into the community as well. So it's a great way for us to look at how hard you're working and checking that we're doing our job properly. So common problems after a stroke. These can consist of two different forms. One is new or added features, and the other one is loss of previous features that you had. So new features include things like spasticity or dystonia. So please, if you've got questions about those, ask at the end, but they're not quite the focus of our presentation. The reason for that is that the loss of the loss of old features includes loss of strength, loss of coordination, and loss of sensation. And these are the most common problems at a functional level that people experience after a stroke. And out of these three factors, it might not surprise you to learn that strength is the most important one. So we know that when you're a lot weaker, this has a bigger impact on your ability to complete an activity than any problems you'd have with coordination. For example, if you're really weak in your legs, you'd be sitting around and you're around here, you might find it really hard to stand up, but it doesn't matter hugely at that point that you can't do higher level coordination skills. But once you're able to stand up and walk, this is when the coordination becomes a lot more important, particularly if you're wanting to walk fast or if you're wanting to start to learn to run. But how do we strengthen muscles if strength is the main problem? So this does change depending on what your strength is like. So we grade strength out of 5 based on the table that we have here. So when your ARC therapist first meets you, they'll often test your strength using the scale or observing your function, like looking at what you're doing when you're sitting to standing. And this helps us to understand how strong different muscles are and then get an indication of what interventions we need to be doing. So don't worry too much about the scale. This is just kind of to explain the point. But when you have really weak muscles at about this level here, you might be having flickers in your toe, for example. We need lots of repetition, so lots of practicing to try and strengthen the pathway between our brain down to our body, but we don't want a really high load. You're not going to be trying to bench press huge weights at this stage. This might also be when we're using something like electrical stimulation as another modality to try and increase the amount of repetition we can get in. Normally, we'd say you need grade 3 strength, which is here against gravity, to be able to walk. So if your muscles are at this level, we'd start practicing functional tasks like sitting to standing, walking in the bars, those sorts of things. At grade 4 to 5, we start to increase the load. So this might include having more weight on your weak leg while doing a task, and will often involve practicing part or a full task repeatedly, such as practicing the stairs, obstacle courses, or more balanced tasks. The important thing for you to remember, though, is that we need enough repetition at the right level of intensity at each stage. So this is why it's so important to liaise and listen to your therapist when they're talking about what you need to be working on. The only thing is, they can't do the practice for you. So key point for you to take away from here, repetition, repetition, repetition. So now that we know some of the basic principles of strengthening, we're just going to go through the stroke guidelines for each aspect. So to start off with here, we've got a strong recommendation from the stroke guidelines to practice reaching while sitting to improve someone's ability to sit independently. In the past, people assumed that it was important to train the muscles of the trunk, so like your stomach muscles, your back muscles, to help you sit up. But in fact, they've more recently discovered that the muscles of our trunk receive messages from the brain through both sides of the body. So they're actually less likely to be affected by a stroke, which tends to affect just one side. It's actually your hip muscles that work your trunk really hard to try and keep it upright and over your hips. And your ankle muscles, when you're sitting and reaching forwards, actually do quite a good job first. So when we're working on your balance and sitting, we need to practice this leaning so that we can use the force from the floor against your feet, because this helps to strengthen your leg muscles. If you look at this video here, I have slowed it down, so hopefully it's not too choppy for you at home. You can see this is me, and I'm sitting and reaching forwards. You can see I'm leaning quite far forwards, and if I put scales underneath my feet, you'd be able to see that there's actually quite a lot of force going through my legs here. This next video is of a client that we have here in our Hurstville clinic who's practicing reaching and wiping a towel on a table. So things to note is that his left foot, which is his affected foot, is actually closer to the bed, which means it's taking more weight. And he's sitting up next to the wall, providing him with a prompt to stay and remain upright. The other fascinating thing that we know about sitting balance is that sitting and reaching works your muscles the same way that standing up does. So this sitting training also helps you to learn how to stand up. In this video, I'm reaching forwards and standing up. It's exactly the same movement to start off as it is when you're sitting and reaching. So standing from sitting. The stroke guidelines here strongly recommend practicing standing up to improve your ability to stand up. And this is what we call specificity of practice. So practicing part or the whole task is generally the best way to get better at it. This can be hard to do if you're home alone or might not have the best balance. So we do sometimes break this down and get you to practice an even smaller part of the task so that we can then continue to work on this when you're with us in the clinic. So when we first go to stand up, the first muscles are actually the ones in the front of our ankles here that start moving us forward and the front of our hips. Then we start accelerating our trunk forwards and we actually reach our maximum speed just before our hips lift up off the bed. Then our thigh muscles and our bottom muscles work to control us as we get closer to standing and help us balance. Oops, sorry. In the second video here, you can see the same client that was sitting and reaching from earlier stands up in a slightly different way to what I do. So you can see he's lost his control there a little bit just as he sat down. He's at least on one of these stands, he reaches his arms out to help him get some momentum. And he's also pushing through the back of his legs against the chair, as you can see right there, just to try and help him to stand up. So there's quite a few ways that he's compensating at the moment. So how would we train sitting to standings? Just some examples. We know that a lot of clients after stroke put less weight through their affected leg. And this makes the whole movement asymmetrical and a lot harder to do. So one of the typical things that we would do is put the good leg away from the chair or the surface that you're standing up from, or to place it on an unstable surface like foam, as this increases the work that your affected leg does by about 50%. So this first video on the left here, this client is standing with her good leg or her right leg on some foam, which is forcing her to put some more weight on her left leg. She's also not needing to use some arm support. And as you can see, she's pretty good at this one. This video on the right here, she's got some scales under her left foot because we've been playing around with trying her to shift her weight. But the key thing is here, she's moving from sitting to standing and then immediately placing her good leg on a step so that she has to put more weight through her left leg. She's not very confident, as this was the first time we tried this, and so she's using the chair for balance, but our aim would be for her to not need the chair, as someone can cheat quite a lot by putting weight through their arm. So to summarize that, there are several ways that we can train standing up. If you can stand up, then we'd get you to practice standing up and just increase the challenge. So we might reduce the height of the chair or get you wearing a backpack that's got some more weights in it. If you're unable to stand, we'd get you reaching and sitting, or maybe do something like squats on the tilt table that works your muscle in a really similar way. Obviously, if you're at home and it's unsafe for you to be reaching and sitting, then we might have to play around with some other ways that other exercises that you can do at home. So your key thoughts for home here are to ensure that you're safe, so follow your therapist's advice, and depending on your ability, practicing the sitting to standing or sitting and reaching can be a really great functional exercise to practice because we do this task many, many times a day. Now we're going to move into standing. So our stroke guidelines here have a strong recommendation to practice activities that challenge your balance. For example, this might be practicing shifting your weight, standing on an unstable surface, and turning your head. But we're going to focus on balance just in a minute. We also have a weak recommendation in addition to challenging the balance for things like virtual reality training or like force platform biofeedback and electromechanically assisted gait or standing training. But again, remember that there can be multiple reasons why this research might be a weak recommendation, such as challenging getting through ethics, challenging comparing different studies, or it's just a new area of research. So in the first year after a stroke, about 73% of people experience at least one fall. So we really want to be avoiding you getting back into hospital and on that hospital diet, because I don't think I've met a single person that enjoys that hospital food. But what does it mean to challenge our balance? There are 3 ways we can do this. So the first is to narrow your base of support. So this is essentially the area over which your body is balanced. I like to imagine a 3-legged stool. If the legs are really wide and spread apart, then it's a lot more stable. But if the legs are narrow, it's a lot more wobbly. So if you are walking and you have your feet really far or really wide apart, or if you're just standing like that, your therapist is probably going to spend some time trying to get you to narrow that base of support. The second way is to move your center of mass. So I like to imagine a seesaw. If you imagine a seesaw, its center of mass is where it's balanced right over the middle, so it can balance exactly like that. So we think of our center of mass as being somewhere in our trunk, and this is constantly moving. So when we're walking, it's moving forwards. When we're sitting and reaching, it's moving. Even just breathing moves that center of mass. So we want to be training this as well, if you're walking and changing direction, for example. The last way is to reduce the support. So we know that as soon as you start holding on to a surface, you reduce the muscle activity that's happening in your legs by a good 50%. So if we're holding on, we're reducing what the muscles are doing, then we're not actually training the muscles to complete those rebalancing activities. So it can be really scary, but your therapist will work really hard to try and find a way that they can safely help you train this, because this is going to be one of the most effective ways to help train your balance. So here are some examples of balance exercises we've used in our neurobalance classes here at Advanced Rehab Centre. So this first one here is in one of the balance classes. You can see this client is narrowing their base of support. So they're standing on one leg and they're moving their center of mass because they're moving their leg to different targets. They're also not holding on, so that's working their balance a lot harder as well. The second video, you can see the client has less foot contact with the surface because it's a river stone, or it's meant to be an uneven surface. They're lifting their feet, so this is moving the center of mass as well, and they're also not holding on, but you can see they're between the bars to remain safe. And this last video is a repeat of what we saw earlier. It's just a reminder that balance isn't just when you're standing up. It can be sitting and reaching, moving from sitting to standing. So in this case, she's standing and then really quickly stepping her foot just to challenge her left leg in terms of its balance a little bit more. So what are the key things that we're needing to think about when we're training balance, or for you to think about when we're working with you to train your balance? So we know to challenge balance effectively, you need to be working hard enough that you're almost falling over. If you can stand on one leg easily, it's not challenging your body to try and do any better. Instead, we might get you to throw and catch a ball or close your eyes and turn your head. And this is going to make you really train to show actual improvements. Context is important. So if you catch the bus all the time, we might need to practice balancing on a surface that's moving a lot. If you've got young children or a pet that likes to run to you, we need to train your ability to tense those muscles and anticipate that impact before they actually reach you. As with everything, it needs to be specific towards your individual needs. And when it comes to practice at home, safety is really key. So at ARC, we'll really work hard to try and help you problem solve where you can practice in the house. This might be standing in the corner of a room with a chair in front of you, or with someone else standing right next to you. Or we might have you here in a class or one-on-one with one of our allied health assistants, where we can have a belt on so we can grab you if you do start to lose your balance. Now we're moving on to walking. I'm sorry, I am flying through these quickly, but I want to leave time for questions at the end here. So the stroke guidelines here have a strong recommendation towards tailored repetitive practice of walking or components of the walking. There's also a weak recommendation for a few other forms of training, such as virtual reality. When we look at walking, we break it into 2 parts. We call them stance phase and swing phase. So here we're looking at the blue leg. So stance phase here is when the blue leg is in contact with the ground and you've got some weight on it. Swing phase is when that leg is stepping forwards, ready for the next step. So it's not in contact with the floor. The most important muscle to help us actually keep moving forwards is a muscle at the back of our ankle, which helps us to point our toes. This provides the power to actually propel us forwards when we're walking. Our hip, so that muscle is about around here. Our hip then works to keep our trunk upright, and our knees just kind of trying to control everything in between. If your muscles are affected, then you're going to have an altered walking pattern. So sometimes we might take the most challenging part of the gait cycle and really hone in on and practice that. And we call this part practice. This is so that we can work on the quality of the movement or the coordination, for example. So just remember, every single stroke survivor presents is different, but there might be some exercises that we use with a lot of you. So here are some examples of people walking. This client here, I'll play the video once. So the video is slowed down, but he is walking at a slower speed than someone who hasn't had a stroke. He spends quite a short time, I'm just going to play that again. He spends quite a short time with his weight on that left leg. He's got quite small steps. And so some exercises that we might do is practicing some weight shifts. So he has to bring his left hip towards a target. So he spend some time getting used to spending more time on that left leg and feeling a little bit more confident in it, as well as building up the strength. We might provide him with visual cues on the floor just to try and help increase his step length, those sorts of things. This video on the right here, again, is also very slowed down. You can see, well, it might be hard to see here, but whenever they're standing on this leg, their left leg, they actually have their knee fully straight and locked back. And that's not the most efficient walking pattern for you. Also, it's really challenging for him to lift his toes. Play the video again. So you can see he kind of has to lean back with his whole trunk to kind of help flick that leg forwards. And it also likes to flick around to the side this way if you watch this step. It comes around here. There's a slight circular movement, okay? So exercises for this client might be kind of swaying from side to side with slightly bent knees to help work on that knee control and feel a little bit more safe. Then we'd add in a forward step, so spending a little bit longer standing on that left leg. So that's an example of part practice that we talked about before. And this is to strengthen the pathways for those movements that are most efficient for your walking. Because often people can walk, but it might not be the most efficient, and that's what we're really trying to work on. We also know that stroke survivors often walk with a reduced speed. Normally, gravity is actually what's helping bring your knee forwards, and when our knee muscles don't need to do much work. But when we're walking slower, such as after a stroke or in the elderly population, you actually need more knee control because you're walking at that slower speed. So don't be surprised if your therapist spends quite a lot of time focusing on what's happening at your knee. I couldn't talk about improving mobility and walking without talking about the Lexo. So many of you will have heard about this or maybe used it. This is our robotic end effector gait machine. So we use the Lexo to increase the number of steps that people can take when they're practicing walking. Before we at ARC first purchased the Lexo, we looked at how many steps people were taking on average during a therapy session, and this was about 500, keeping in mind that this is focusing on a walking goal, not just a standing goal. This is reasonable, but what the research was actually starting to say is that to get the best outcomes, people needed to be looking at taking over 2,500 steps for each session. So the Lexo is great for that, but it also helps to add a sense of safety. So here we've got our body weight support harness, which can be used to support your weight when you're on the Lexo if your legs are about to give way, or it can actually be used to hoist you in and out. Here, your feet get locked into the foot plates, so your feet you're not going to trip and fall over everything. And in a traditional system, before this, robotics became a lot more popular. We used to have people suspended in a harness similar to this one above a treadmill. But because we spent so much time lifting and helping to focus, lifting your feet for you and helping to focus on that weight shift, we couldn't focus as much on the quality of the walking and the movement. And I can very much attest to the fact that helping someone out on a treadmill when you're lifting their foot for them is very, very tiring. There are also rails to hold on while you're on there or when you're transferring in and out. But keep in mind, we might be wanting to work on you being able to balance and swing your arms at the same time. So we might ask you not to hold the rails. And there's also a computer screen here where you can see a real-time kind of interface of where your weight is positioned, how much help you're needing to lift your feet, for example. And it can help with the rhythm of walking, as well as providing all sorts of other feedback for us as well. So these videos here show a client on the Lexo here at the Physical Clinic. So this first client here, you can see that they're very loosely strapped in here. So this is our back support and pelvic support. We can have people a lot tighter built in, but this person was relatively high level. You can see the straps go around and under her hips, and her feet are locked in. So this client is much higher level. I believe that we were working on her knee control at this point. The next video here, sorry about the quality of it, but I hope you can see that here, this every time they're standing on this leg right now, this hip is sinking down. And so this is when the Lexo can be a really great machine or treatment modality for us, because we can get you walking, get your heart rate up like we were talking about with that intensity earlier, and focus on that control in your hip. Okay, so just bringing us back to our objectives and our final last one. What can you actually do to optimize your recovery? So we're just going to kind of briefly summarize and revisit the points that we've already covered before we kind of move on to some questions. So remember that idea of neuroplasticity. This is the idea that the brain is able to change and that that's how we see improvements. This is what we're really trying to do, all our therapy to target and base everything on. So what can you as a client or a family member of a client do is identify your goals. We as therapists really need you to provide us with the direction that we're taking you on that therapy journey. So also remember though, sometimes you need to be able to walk before you can run. So sometimes you might have a lofty goal of returning to skiing, and we might go, okay, let's just focus on being able to walk a little bit faster to start off with. And it's absolutely great that you have these big goals. We're still going to work towards it. We sometimes just need to break them down a little bit more. In case you haven't gotten the message strongly enough yet, repetition is key. We really want to work hard to strengthen that brain and body message. So all that practice that you can do at home, trying to put in what you've been learning in your appointments with your therapists is so important. Specificity. So we need to practice that hard task. If your sit to stands are challenging, we're going to get you practicing your sit to stands. To improve your walking, we need to improve your walking. So just sitting and reaching isn't going to improve your walking, but it might improve your sit to stand. Thinking about all these things as we're moving forwards. Challenge. We often don't see any improvements unless we really challenge our systems. We know our body likes to cruise along at this level. If it's finding this easy, it's not going to make any improvements. If something is a bit harder, it goes, oh, maybe I should change. And its new baseline becomes a little bit higher. Safety. So please work with your therapist to ensure that you can do some exercises at home while also being safe, because this is your journey. Remember that this is your journey and your recovery is unique only to you. So this might include accounting for other factors, such as other medical conditions like diabetes or heart conditions or lung conditions. That might mean that it's hard for you to get your heart rate working so hard. And that's fine. We're going to work around that and do what we can. You might experience a lot of pain, a lot of fatigue. You might have a lot of social stresses going on in your life, so you can't focus so much on your therapy. You might be trying to fit in work. This is all fine. What our job here as therapists is to be there for you to help problem solve, to work out what will work well for you in your life. So please take ownership of your journey. We're here to guide you, but you're the one that's living it. So with that, do we have any questions from people? If you can pop them through in the chat box. No burning questions as yet? I'm just going to hover for another minute or so in case anyone does have anything they want to add in. Please do feel free to unmute yourself as well if you do have any questions and you just want to ask via voice rather than typing. Oh, one thing in the Q&A. Are the slides available? I will check with the main leaders of our academy to see if they can, and they should be able to get in touch with you, but that's a good question. What can you do to create movement when there is none, such as a flicker to movement? That's a really good question. So if people do have a flicker, then that's great. We know that you've got that pathway from your brain all the way down to, say, your ankle or your foot, where you can lift it up. That's where we work on really helping you focus on the movement. You need to be really focused and thinking about that movement really hard. And we might use the electrical stimulation. So we put the electrical stimulation pads on. I'll just use my arm here, seeing as you can see it. You might put the pads here for someone if they don't have any movement in their wrist. Put the pads on and get you to really think really hard about trying to lift your wrist up, and you practice it at the same time as the machine stimulates the muscle. And that helps us to really reinforce that pathway as well as strengthening the muscles. And then we go from there and strengthen more and more and more. Can you increase speed on the treadmill? Not sure if you mean the treadmill here or the Lexo. So the Lexo, we can certainly increase the speed. We can play around with increasing how wide your feet are, the length of each step, the speed of the machine, so how many steps per minute that you're taking. There's one mode that is the main one that we use is passive. So the machine will help prompt you if you're not able to initiate the steps. There's also another mode called assistive, where you have to work really hard. In terms of an actual treadmill, we certainly can increase your speed on the treadmill. We'd just be wanting to make sure that you're able to lift your feet up quickly enough, because the last thing we want you to do is to be falling over. We also might use something like cueing of cadence. So we might put a metronome on and see, okay, does that help you if you're trying to slow down your steps, but actually walk at the same speed? That might actually get you walking with bigger steps. We might focus on that first before we actually speed up the treadmill. Right, another question, a few questions in the Q&A. Yep, I believe that this is being recorded, so hopefully you will be able to, the question was, access to the recording would be great so I can share with my dad. I believe this is being recorded. I'm sure there will be some way to get access to this as a playback, because obviously not everyone's available at this time of day. Any other questions? All right, I think we might leave it there. I might end this now. If you do have further questions, if you're working with a therapist from ARC, please do come and ask us. All of us should be knowing very much the similar things and be using similar and the same techniques. So we're always willing to share knowledge and receive some of your feedback. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.